If you were to introduce yourself, who is Aminatta Forna?
Aminatta Forna is quite simply a writer. I'm a writer in many forms. I'm a writer of memoir, of essays. I'm a writer of novels, short stories. And I've also written in other contexts as well. I've written for television and radio and for newspapers and magazines. So I'm a writer, principally, first, foremost, and forever, a wordsmith. For any writer, I think it's difficult to pass out exactly what elements have made us who and what we are, because so much of it happens on a subconscious level. And also because we aren't anybody else, you know. It's a sort of existential question. But, you know, if I were to think consciously, what is there in my background and upbringing that has influenced who and what I am, I would say the timing of my birth, probably. And I think that goes for almost any writer or artist on earth, or creator of any kind. Inventors, you know, invent in terms of what's needed at a particular time, whether it be the light bulb or, you know, an electric car. So much as my father was born at a particular time in his country's history, which I call being born at the crossroads, being born at the time when those countries were becoming, just before those countries across Africa became independent, so that they were of an age when independence was achieved. The men and women who Wole Soyinka calls the Renaissance generation. I'm a daughter of the Renaissance generation. So I think being raised by those particular people at that particular time, when the Renaissance, the dreamed of Renaissance was not being, you know, the dreams were not being fulfilled, were not being granted, were not being made real. And so I think that it has fallen to a generation of writers to sort of to unpick that. So I think that first and foremost would be a significant influence on my first 3 books, my memoir, Ancestor Stones, and The Memory of Love. I was born at a time, I came of age at a time when my country was going to war as a direct consequence of all of those events. And that became something that I felt imperative to respond to. So I think it's an accident of timing. Those are the elements that so often propel someone to create in the way that they do, and to use the voice that they have to address the questions that they think need asking. If I'd been born at a completely different time, I dare say I would have produced very different work.
Growing during that time of war, but also during a period where there was hope, African countries were emerging from the tragedy of colonialism. What did you read? Do you remember what you used to read at the time?
In the 1960s and 70s, which was a time of both hope and destruction. So the 60s was the time of hope, 70s was really the time of destruction. So I was growing up in Sierra Leone, in between periods of exile, of course. My father was imprisoned by the regime. Family fled to Britain. What was I reading? Well, we were like many other African writers. The only library we had access to was the British Council Library in Freetown. So I borrowed books from there. And I read extremely eclectically. I think that's the word that I would use to describe my reading throughout my, you know, from the earliest when I could read all the way through to my teens and 20s, I read extremely eclectically. Of course, I read the British junior canon, you know. I mean, I read Enid Blyton, right? You know, I read The Secret Seven. I was a great fan of Jack London, whose books were very present in the British Council Library. I went on to, I read a great deal of poetry from the Victorian era, the English Victorian era. it wasn't just reading, of course. I was raised by Sierra Leoneans who told me stories. And so I count that oral history within my reading at that time. I spent a lot of time at the back of the house with the staff and with the women, and I heard stories there. And let's not forget my mother was Scottish, and so I also received a great deal of Scottish oral history as well from my grandparents. And one of the things that stays with me is how remarkably similar that kind of folklore is. So going through my life, I've always tended to see the similarities in cultures rather than the differences. But then moving on through my teens, I studied French. I studied English literature. I was at school in England, but I also studied French literature. I studied Spanish literature. So I grew up reading André Gide. I grew up reading Machado. I grew up reading Maupassant. I grew up reading Lorca. You know, I read right across the board. Orwell was another influence on the young teenage me. So, you know, there was a great deal that went into the sensibility that I eventually brought to my writing. And let's not forget Harold Robbins. I think we would all be being coy if we claimed only to have read great works of literature when we were younger. But of course, like any, I had a wonderful conversation with a Lebanese writer called Rabbi Alameddin recently about Harold Robbins, because you know, these were the kinds of books that teenagers were passing around. Sidney Sheldon, Harold Robbins. I mean, you know, what a great way to learn plot and suspense, frankly, than from a writer like that. So it wasn't all the great, you know, I read just as much for fun and thrills as anybody else did.
At what point did you start to write?
That's a good question. At what point did I start to write? Or at what point did I start to publish? I was a great narrator of stories before I was a writer. So thinking back to that oral history and the way that most stories came to me through oral telling, that's really the way I approached storytelling at the beginning. I told stories, I told them to my friends, I told them to my classmates, I told them to my family. And I think that I did that for years and years and years before I began to think about putting those stories down on, or any story down on paper. I didn't start to write creatively until I was about 15 or 16. And I did that at school. I was encouraged by one of my teachers, two of my English teachers, actually. And I began to write. I realized that here was, you know, the form. I'd found the form. I could begin to write and I could stay with a story for hours at a time. You know, I mean, I could lose track of time, and this is still a feature of my writing life. I got on a plane some years ago, and I don't know what I had done to deserve it, but I had the worst seat on the aeroplane. I was right on the back row and right in the middle of the back row, and this was a flight that was going from Los Angeles to London. And I thought, you know, the only thing I can do here now to keep my sanity is to write. And so I managed to get my computer down. I managed to sit huddled over it. And in that way, I passed an 18-hour flight, or 16, 18-hour flight. I produced an entire short story from scratch. The short story went on to be shortlisted for a prestigious award. And the character in the short story went on to become a main character for a novel that I wrote sometime later called The Memory of Love. So, but I have always been able to lose myself in writing. And once I discovered I had that ability, barring a few hurdles along the way, like, you know, the requirement to make a living out of writing and other things like that, and my parents' ambition that I become a lawyer, I have never ever lost that feeling for writing. I would rather write than do anything else.
tell me in general, what would you say are the thematic concerns of your work?
Well, if you look at my work right up to happiness, so starting with The Devil That Danced on the Water, which was a work of non-fiction, it was a memoir of my father, of Sierra Leone, but of Africa generally in the 1970s and what was happening politically and socially. And then you look at Ancestor Stones, which is a novel written in the voices of 4 women, and it spans a whole century, again, of Sierra Leone's history. But each woman is born into a different era. One is born into the pre-colonial era, effectively, before colonialism really makes itself felt where she is. Another is born into the era of the missionaries. Another is born into the era of independence. So they all have a different fate in life, but they don't really know the ways in which that fate is controlled by circumstances which are taking place, events which are taking place thousands and thousands of miles away. Westminster, for example. And then I wrote The Memory of Love, and again, dealt with the prelude and aftermath to war, but in a shorter, mostly the aftermath, but in a shorter span, but asked questions about personal responsibility in war. And then I moved theatre to Croatia, because I was really interested in a country that had gone through a contemporaneous civil conflict in which I could see very many similarities, but an outside world, particularly an outside media, seemed to be incapable of seeing those similarities between both the countries and the causes of war. And then I wrote Happiness, which was really about a resolution of a lot of those ideas. And each book, in ways that I didn't anticipate happening, gave birth to the next book. I would start thinking, I wrote The Devil That Danced on the Water, and I began to think about the longer term history. I began to think about how people in the villages' fates were determined by macro politics. They had no idea these decisions were being made elsewhere, but they were impacting their everyday life. I wrote The Memory of Love because when I was researching The Devil That Danced on the Water, I spoke to so many people of a generation who, one would argue, had failed to act, had committed a dereliction of duty, or omission, I should say, of duty, of care to their country. How did they feel about that? What was their rationale, and how did they feel about that? And what was the country left with? And I've described The Hired Man. One of the things that I really think about in my work is the fact that I'm a transnational African. Right? I'm an African who has grown up in many different countries, and I have a particular perspective. And one thing I've always been able to see are similarities. And what I could see were astounding similarities between Croatia and Sierra Leone. We could talk about that later. And yet the war in Sierra Leone was, if it was ever being compared, was compared to, say, Rwanda. Actually, a very different set of circumstances. But because it took place on the African continent, lazy narrators would look to Rwanda rather than actually, if you looked at the political roots of a war, Croatia would have been a better example. So, the big themes: politics, war, trauma, by which I mean generational in terms of population, overcoming trauma, and resilience, restoration of justice or of peace. Peace building. But there's been a very strong arc which I did not foresee when I began to write. I didn't say I'm going to write this arc of books and they're all going to interlock in a certain kind of way. That's looking back on how it came to be. But questions would arise that persisted with me and that I wanted answered.
Why are those things important to you, Aminatta? Why are they?
I would hope those things would be important to everybody. I mean, they're important things, aren't they? Survival. It's about human survival.
Where does resilience come from? And you say sometimes you find resilience in writing. Do you find that?
Oh, I said that, did I? You find resilience in writing? Well, yes. Let me just begin that answer again. Yes, I would say that one can find resilience in writing in the sense that what we now know about the human psyche is that narrative helps people make sense of their experiences. So writing or reading, or, if you live in a Western country, paying a therapist to listen to you talk. But narrative is what makes sense of how we make sense of the things that happen to us. Right? We put them together, we put them into context, we give them the time they need, and we reflect on them. And you can do that either as a reader or as a writer. You can also do it as a playwright. Sierra Leone has a huge history of drama on both theatre within local theatre, but also radio drama. And one of the ways in which artists have helped people to come to terms with what happened during the wars by using drama. I choose long form fiction, it's my chosen form, but I see that it really does help people to build on resilience, create resilience. I'm not sure. I think one would have to have some sort of basis to work on. But I certainly think that it's one of the building blocks of survival.
You lost your father when you were pretty young. How has that shaped you? How has that experience, how has that loss shaped your thoughts? And how has that been reflected in your work?
Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like not to lose a parent in the way that I did. And in fact, that thought gave rise to the novel, The Memory of Love. What would I have thought of my father had he survived? And had he done whatever it took to survive? It's a very difficult question because the kinds of compromises he would have been required to make in order to survive in the society at that time, short of going into exile, would have made him a very different person. I was left with an extremely strong impression of my father, and he left that both in the way that he raised us and he talked to us, but also in the writings that he left. And I'm profoundly glad that he did leave some of his thoughts on paper. He lived a very short life. He was dead before he was 40, and I'm well past that now. So, one can look back on one's, late 30s and think, gosh, how very young that generation was when they were dealing with these huge issues. So I would say that the effect it had on my life, both practically and artistically, is extremely profound, because I had to first of all, I had to forge my own path, but secondly, I wanted to make sense of it. And by which I mean, find a cause and effect. I don't mean find a good reason for it. I think we always knew there was never a good reason, but find the pattern of cause and effect. And what it's done for my writing is evident. I've got several books that all really started in the same place, with the death of my father and of a country, near death of a country. And then, looks at how and why these things happen. I will say this, that what it's given me is a very strong sense that things don't happen by accident. Politically and socially, things don't happen by accident. And so I have always been very interested in tracing back either ideas or events. And I call it the flap of the butterfly wings. There's a theory of chaos which says, sometime before every hurricane begins with the flap of the butterfly's wings. So somewhere across the world, a tiny current is set off, and somewhere else, it eventually builds into a hurricane. And so that's really what I see about so many things that we think are incidental or accidental, is in fact, not only can they be traced back to the first flap of the butterfly wing, but actually somebody did that, right? It wasn't a butterfly. Somebody did something, that we are all part of a process which leads somewhere, and we should be aware of that. So every time somebody says, well, who am I? What can I do? I'm only, I'm just. Well, none of us are. We're actually all part of a living organism, which is humankind.
When I was looking at your biography, and I realized you were trained as a lawyer, but you decided to be a writer.
I didn't want to be a lawyer. My father wanted me to be a lawyer. And I think the reason, I don't know how old you are, but I think anyone under the age of 30, over the age of 30, who was brought up in an African household was probably at some point, or an Indian household, or a Pakistani household, or many South American households. I mean, all my friends have the same joke, is, so you can be anything you want so long as you're a lawyer or a doctor. And what kind of lawyer do you want to be, or what kind of doctor do you want to be? And that was our household too. My parents were no different. A profession, right? Something solid, something achievable that didn't require inherited money, that you could go to university, you could get a qualification, you could succeed on those terms. You didn't have to, they had to give us enough of an education to get us going, but there were very few careers in those days that you could move forward in on your own merits as an African woman, right? So my parents were no different from anybody else. That's what they wanted for us. And being short of any better ideas, and I can tell you a story about when I told my careers advisor that I wanted to be a writer. I mean, she put me off as fast and as she possibly could. Nobody was encouraging me to be a writer, I can tell you that. Absolutely not. So, I bowed to my late father's wishes and I studied law. And I was not a happy law student. It did not suit me. The constraints of thinking didn't suit me. Memorizing case law, which was so dry, didn't suit me. I think if I studied law now, I would probably see more in it than I did at the time. This was the 1980s, and I was studying in London, and most of the people I was studying with were going to go and work for investment banks or, shipping broking firms, or go into the, in the financial institutions. I couldn't really see myself in all of that, but law essentially did not suit me. And I got my degree, I fulfilled my obligations, I got my degree, and I pivoted into journalism.
Have you considered writing in a Sierra Leonean language?
No, is the short answer. I have not considered writing in a Sierra Leonean language. I'll tell you two good reasons. One is my language is Timni and I don't speak it well enough to write in it. And the second reason is that Timni didn't have an orthography, or indeed a complete orthography, until reasonably recently. It's only in historical terms, it's become a written language a millisecond ago. So that option was never available to me. English is my first language. I grew up speaking English. I've actually written in many different kinds of English, and we can talk about that, writing in Englishes. But I've always written in English for the reason that I know the language best, and I have the greatest facility in it.
Do you think English is an African language?
I think English is certainly an African language. Quite possibly it is the African language if you were an alien and you came down to Earth and you wandered around trying to pin the linguistic donkey tail on the map, I think you would assume that English came from the African continent. There are more English speakers on the African continent than anywhere else, including North America. So is English an African language? It is definitely an African language. At the most recent African Studies Association meeting, I gave a talk, a keynote called Writing in Englishes, in all of the ways that African writers, but also other people who have adopted, other writers from different parts of the world who've adopted English as their language of choice to write in, have bent the language to their will. And African writers are first and foremost among those. Even when I've written in English, I've always bent it to the tonality or the linguistics of the people who are speaking. So Ancestor Stones, I wrote very much in the rhythm of the women whose stories they were. I had listened to those stories as a child. When I was researching the book, I went out and interviewed dozens of women in my family, in my village, in the surrounding villages, anyone really who would talk to me, who had lived during the era from the if I could find anybody from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way through to the 70s and 80s, anyone who's willing to give me an interview, I recorded for research purposes. These are not interviews that you're going to find this is not research you can do in a library, right? These are homespun domestic tales about, being married, having children, working, family, life. So, but I recorded them all, including the ones that were in Timney, typically. I did a couple in Mende and quite a few in Creole. My Timney was not very good at the time. I actually spent quite a lot of time learning Timney with my stepmother so that I could take the rhythms of the language and render them into English. And it's interesting, I'm not actually particularly musically minded, but I spoke to a musicologist when I was giving a talk at a university in Oklahoma. And she said, she had noticed that sections of the text had a particular rhythm, and she had tapped it out and realized that this rhythm kept repeating. And that was because I was looking for that. I could hear the way these women spoke, and I was looking to recreate it in English. And with my novel Happiness, for example, I had a Ghanaian and an American, a white American and a Ghanaian, but I also had a few other characters. So my main characters were Ghanaian and European American, but I also had some other minor characters who were Sierra Leonean and Nigerian, and I was flipping between the Englishes, trying to think, okay, Ghanaian English is kind of like this, American English is a bit like this, and then there was English, because there was a British English, which is sort of authorial voice. So there are very many forms of English, and one could say exactly the same about French. You look at the work of Alain Mabancou, who's completely bent French to his own artistic needs and desires. So all of these languages now belong to us, and I think we should have no doubts about that.
Briefly tell us about that process of writing.
Well, a lot of writing comes in thinking. So I think for a very long time, and usually I start with a question. Now, when I say I start with a question, the question may not be formed, right? It's a line of inquiry, but something that is interesting me. So let's take a book, for example, The Hired Man. When The Hired Man came out, every single critic universally had to comment on the fact that here was a woman of color writing a book in the voice of a Croatian man set in Croatia. Wasn't this extraordinary? And I suppose I was surprised by that in a way that I shouldn't have been. I guess I hadn't realized that our lanes were set for us and that we were not supposed to step outside them. sadly, we find ourselves in a position where, and we can talk about this, a younger generation seems to be intent on replacing those lines. But there was certainly in that moment, I had good publishers who were willing to explore. And what set me off on the path of setting a book in Croatia was this. I was working at the BBC at the time of the Sierra Leonean conflict, and I was called on quite a lot to help the foreign correspondents who were reporting it. Overwhelmingly, I would say, beyond the BBC, the war was reported as a incomprehensible eruption of African savagery, right? That's how the Western outlets reported the war. It was incomprehensible. It could not be comprehended, and there was no point trying to comprehend it. It was also described as tribal, which it wasn't. It was regional. It was never, ever tribal. And I became so frustrated that it was actually my prompt to leave the BBC and to write The Devil That Danced on the Water, because my father, among others of his generation, had precisely foreseen what would happen to a country that had decided to follow a dictator, strong man, towards its own destruction. A war that was going on at exactly the same time as the war in the former Yugoslavia. And if you remember the way in which that war was reported by precisely the same outlets that were reporting the war in Sierra Leone, was in every single, forensically, with every single detail, right? The Bosniaks, the Chetniks, the Orthodox Croatians, the Muslim Bosnians. I mean, absolutely everything. We knew all the names of the main actors. We knew everything about that war, and I was really furious that nobody, and I knew some of these correspondents. They were covering both wars, and they refused to see the similarities. And if you look at those two countries, they are the same size within, a few, 100,000 square meters. They have an almost identical sized population. They are extraordinarily beautiful, in fact. So they're actually very similar with the kind of coastline that they have, the beauty, the, at one point, dependence on an emerging tourist industry. They were also largely rural, right? So people living in villages. And the biggest similarity of all, the populations have withstood 25 years of authoritarian government, followed by a massive economic collapse, right? Those are the conditions for war were set, right? Now, you then looked at what were some of the differences in the war, because I remember thinking, but the war in Croatia, it started so quickly, and Sierra Leone was such a slow burn, where it took us so many years to go to war, and yet the Croatians just seemed to go like that. I asked this question of people who were reporting the war. Well, they said they could never answer Sierra Leone because they didn't know anything about it, but they go, oh, well, it's a war start. They had no thoughtful answers. But I began to interrogate it, and eventually the answer came from a war correspondent who I knew, who was a white Kenyan, in fact. And he said, the reason that war kicked off so quickly was because they were a hunting society, and every man had a gun, and every man knew how to use it. And there was the answer. That was the first answer. The second answer was, of course, because they had national service, right? So Sierra Leone were farmers, for a start, couldn't leave the fields, right? Not trained to use that kind of weaponry. And we didn't have a background of military service. So it was extremely hard to get any kind of army together with any speed. Fode Sankoh went to Liberia and was, funded by various bodies there to put together a fighting force, and look what kind of fighting force it was. And if you look at the atrocities that were committed, if you look at the sort of signature atrocities, what was it in the former Yugoslavia? In Croatia, it was the sniper, right? Because these people were, they were good shots. What was it in Sierra Leone? It was the amputated hand, the amputated limb. Why? Because it was a nation of farmers, and because they picked up the first thing they had, just as the Croatians picked up rifles, the West African villagers picked up the scythe. So joining those dots and making sense of something is why I went to Croatia to write a book. I looked at it with an African sensibility, and I don't think that, I don't think anyone's ever done that, actually. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think anyone's ever done that. But it, it shows the importance of straying out of our presupposed lanes, and it, to me, shows, what an eye can bring to the world that is capable of seeing it in an international context.
One of your favorite places to go is Timbuktu. Tell me about it.
Mali is one of my favorite countries in the world. Actually, I love Kenya as well. I like big landscapes. I like the Sahara, but actually I first went to Mali to cover a war, an uprising by the Tuareg rebels. And I was so struck by the country that I went back twice more to make documentaries, one about the art of Mali, and then another one about the lost libraries of Timbuktu. Mali is a country with an amazing history that is very well known in its population. So when I say an amazing history, everyone's got an amazing history. But what I loved about Mali was the presence of that history in the country, the way in which people knew their history and their phenomenal pride in their history, which was shown over and over again in the artifacts they produced, in their writing, in their narration, in their filmmaking, in their music and everything. But it's an incredibly beautiful country. Right from, if you geographically, if you move through it from the kind of almost equatorial belt, right up through the Sahel and Sahara. And anyway, so The Lost Libraries of Timbuktu, one of those films, I made it in 2008. It first aired in 2009. It continues to go out on BBC World Service, and it remains one of their most popular films ever. And it shows, if ever there was doubt, in the enduring and significant interest that the world has in knowing about African countries and the history. And I think one of the things that it told me, the time that I spent in Mali making these documentaries, was to think in deep time. And I think one of the things that so many of us, the mistakes we make, is to think of Africa in shallow time. It's like 20, 30 years. I used to have people saying to me, it's been so long since independence, and they were saying this in the 1990s. And even then I think, well, 30 years is the blink of an eye in a country's history. But, I think when you think about deep time, it gives you more hope. All those amazing empires, cultures that pre-existed in Mali. And I remember one wonderful moment when I was interviewing a Songhai chief, and I said something about the French, and he went, the French. And he said, they didn't even last 100 years. And then he began to narrate the history of the Songhai Empire and the Ghana Empire before that, and so that was a sort of wonderful moment, really. And I think we need to think in those terms, in terms of deep time, and not just, and I think he's right. How long did the French last and even make it to 100 years?
If I were to show this conversation to young girls in Sierra Leone or in Gambia or in Comoros or in Nairobi, And they asked me, what do you think would be the advice you would give us? What would you tell them?
To any young person wanting to be a writer, I would say this. It is a thorny path. It's not easy to be an artist of any kind, particularly in these times when the world seems to reward, those who simply wish to amass wealth. It's unlikely that you will become rich, except intellectually and emotionally and mentally rich. Those are the ways in which writing makes you rich. So write what matters to you, write what you're passionate about, write what you want to be remembered by, write what is important to you. Don't be swayed by either the market, do not be swayed by the gatekeepers. There will always be those two elements to either work around or fight your way through or find an ally within. And they actually dictate quite a lot of what gets published. But find your allies, find the people who think like you and who champion what you do, and stay with your passion. A good friend of mine was Abdul Razak Gurna, is Abdul Razak Gurna. And Abdul Razak Gurna wrote what he loved, and he wrote what he loved for decades. And some of it gained some notice, and some of it didn't gain very much notice at all. And his publisher is the same publisher as my work. And one day his publisher, in a fit of despair, wrote on social media about his being omitted from a roundup of great post-colonial writers in a British newspaper. And she said, I've published him for X number of decades. And she said, and here is another article overlooking him and his contribution. And she said, at some time, the heart begins to despair. 2 weeks later, he won the Nobel. So that's what I feel, you write what matters to you. And I remember having a conversation with him when he came to Washington, DC, where I now live, and we went for a long walk along the river. And I've always been in a terrible hurry about my writing. Okay, I'm always like, oh, what would I write next? What would I write next? What would I write next? And as we walked along, he turned to me and he went, what's the hurry? And I remember that, and I thought, what is the hurry? What is the hurry? And I remembered as well, when I was a very young writer and I got my agent, who's still with me 25 years later, and is a good ally, and I always understood what it was I wanted to do as a writer. And I said to him, I want to be writing when I'm 90 years old. Well, I don't want to be the flash in the pan writer who writes, I don't know, whatever it is, the young adult fiction or the sci-fi, or, the next gets picked up by Hollywood. I just want to be still writing and still being published when I am 80 years old, 90 years old. And he said, okay, I've got that. He said, now I know what you want from your career. That's what we're going for. And so, think long, stay with what you're passionate about.
Thank you very much. I've taken more time than I had promised, and I really, really want to thank you, and congratulations.
Not at all. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I'm remembering back to when I first started writing and wanted to write. One of the things I did was go to talks by writers all the time. And it wasn't the big industry it is nowadays. There weren't all these festivals, now you can't move for a festival, but there just weren't that many. And I used to go and listen to writers talk and listen to them articulate their purpose and their method, and I would line up afterwards with my book to have it signed. And, wonderfully, one of those writers, Isabel Allende, who I waited in line to have my book signed, my copy of House of the Spirits, years go by, and, she ends up introducing me for one of my events. So
Yeah.
it's a community that looks after its own.